I was born in Ohio, Northeast Ohio. My parents were raised in a very conservative Anabaptist setting, which is called apostolic, not the apostolic Pentecostal, but more of a conservative Mennonite circle. And so they were raised in that, and that's where I was from the time I was young till the time I was about 8 years old. And they left that because of some conflicts they were having doctrinally speaking, and some tradition and so on. We went directly to a church plant that was happening at the time, which was a Baptist, independent Baptist, which was a very strong fundamentalist church. And we were there until around between my 19th and 20th year. When I was married at that time, we left kind of as a family and my new wife, and we started another church plant that's very, very similar to that one. And so we were there until about 2004, when we really felt that God was taking us out of that type of a setting. And while we had our differences and such, there was not one specific instance that was saying we got to get out of here because we have tremendous difficulties. That wasn't it at all. We really felt that God was taking us a different direction, and so we started meeting in a home type fellowship. The thing about that is that whenever you're in a setting where there's a paid pastor, and I'm not downing on that for anyone who choose that, but when you're in that type of setting, you don't have necessarily the responsibility or the getting into the Bible that you might have if you're getting together with a group of believers, and if somebody doesn't have something to share, you're going to be sitting there looking at each other with a blank face. So out of necessity, my dad and myself kind of became the ones to dig in, and after we started doing that, it became more of we couldn't hardly dig in enough, because there were so many things that were starting to come out, so many things that we had thought were one way, but yet turned out to maybe not be quite the way we thought they were, from different contexts we were learning, and so on and so forth. So that's and we're still doing a home type fellowship to this time. Have a great group of believers that we have a lot of things in common with, and a great bunch of people that we really love. That's a good question. I have to say, there probably wasn't one specific book that led to this decision. James Dunn has been, I've liked his work about as much as anyone. I've found many things of N.T. Wright extremely illuminating, although there's many difficulties I have with some of his content. Obviously, Anthony's books have been a great benefit in our great content. Probably what the structure and the style of book that I was probably the most influential upon my deciphering a lot of this stuff that we discuss would probably be Greg Deigel's book, They Never Told Me This in Church. Not that it had content that was necessarily new to me, but that such a book was in existence, and that people would actually read such a book. So that would probably be the number one book, because it was the first that I was really exposed to of this type of content. So yeah, the research and influence, there's a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different ways that many different people go at this. For me, a lot of my research, as far as for the bulk content of the book, was already done. A lot of what I came to believe, what was influential into my decision of saying, what is it that the Bible teaches? That amount of my research led me to this. And so the research for the book was basically going into some of the areas that weren't as necessarily clear to me and fine-tuning them, such as like Philippians chapter 2. While I had a good understanding, as I mentioned before, James Dunn, he has a good second Adam Christology in there. there were other things that weren't quite as clear. I read something just not too long ago that was done by Philip Jenkins, and he's a historian. He wrote the Jesus Wars book, and people, it's on his blog called The Anxious Bench, but there was another contributor that was writing, and he was addressing the same question. What is it that we do that's right or wrong when we do research for a book? And his perspective was and his practice was similar to my own. A lot of times when I'm writing on an issue, I have a pretty good selection in my library, and I might have 5 to 10 books sitting on my desk, just doing research as I go along. Things that come to me, I write a little bit and look at some more things and say, oh, I didn't see this before, and so you're doing much as you go along. As far as when you go into the New Testament, when you're talking about source material for, well, even in the later developments, you can't hardly talk about church history without entering into some of the early patristic writings, and then later on into the Nicene Fathers. So you have to necessarily go into those just to see what they said. Not that you can read them exhaustively, of course. I mean, it would take somebody a lifetime to read everything, but then it's invaluable to take writers like Rubinstein, for instance, the book When Jesus Became God. Other ones like Charles Freeman, the AD 381, and other books that there's similar books, and I mentioned Jesus Wars. So these books are invaluable for pulling different pieces out that are part of this complex puzzle that has given rise to all this confusion as to, I mean, even what does even orthodoxy contain? So yeah, there's not necessarily one answer to how research should be done or how writing should be done. It's more a matter of saying, how does it work for an individual on an individual basis. This book is aimed at is an apologetic work, basically. The nature of the book was that there are a lot of people who are very, very curious about some of these issues that modern Christianity would dub as taboo. That this is an area that's untouchable. We can't go there. Don't ask this question. And people I felt like this is an area that's sacred ground that you can't go. No entering here. By necessity, I've had people email me and ask questions that they wouldn't necessarily ask somebody else. So I found myself answering lots of emails and spending a good amount of time answering emails, which is what kind of gave rise to the whole premise of the book. And so whenever somebody would find out, well, he believes this, so they would write me and say, do you really believe this? I'm curious, well, have you ever read this? For instance, John 1:1, they might come to me and say, well, have you ever read John 1:1? Well, of course I've read John 1:1. I've considered these passages, I've looked at these passages, and so a lot of what I do in the book is address these passages from another perspective. We've always heard John 1:1 as an example for, in the beginning was the Son of God, basically, is how we go into reading it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was that sort of thing. And so we come out with, that's the only way you can interpret John 1:1. That's not necessarily the case. There are many other ways to view this passage, and there are many, many other theologians and exegetes who have viewed this passage differently over the years. Those things, however, are a lot of times obscure and for sure discouraged from being read in modern Christianity. So I explore a lot of these different things. One of the major thrusts of the book as well is highlighting how God loves story and how God communicates a good deal of theology through story. We come into the New Testament and we find Jesus speaking a lot in parables. He teaches in parables, and he gives some of his greatest teaching moments in story form or in a picture metaphor type. So I think to miss out on the story thrust of the Bible itself is to ignore a good deal of what God is wanting to communicate to us. And so that's a large emphasis in my book, is to get back to the story that God is being told, and how does Jesus fit into this, and then looking at a lot of the passages that are traditionally used for propagating certain doctrines and later theological foundations. There were a few things that I encountered that I didn't quite expect. One would be in Genesis, and this is before a lot of this research happened, actually before I was properly writing a book, so to speak. But it was research that would ultimately become part of the book. One passage that is often difficult for many Christians is Genesis 1:26, when God says, "Let us make man in our image." So this plurality is often used as early substantiation for a Trinitarian perspective. So I was looking into a lot of sources for this, and a lot of interpretation. The rabbis have been interpreting this passage for years, and the largest portion of research that I found relating to this passage was pertaining to the divine counsel. There are other instances. There's three other instances of this plural usage, possibly 5 if we use another from Isaiah. But that was one that was a lot bigger than I ever envisioned it to be. I didn't expect that it was such a. I had heard of the divine counsel early on and kind of had a little bit of a basis for it, but I thought it was, just somebody's explanation to try to get around a difficult or a more plain reading of Genesis 1:26, and it wasn't. It was absolutely phenomenal how full the Old Testament and the New Testament is of this concept, plus many of the extra biblical pieces of literature that the Jews had in not only the Second Temple period, but in the pseudepigraphal writings and so on and so forth, was very full. I guess another one that was bigger than I thought it would be too is in Philippians chapter 2. When I started digging into the context of Philippians, I didn't realize how much of Paul's writing to the Philippians and how he wrote to them was very much based on Philippians context, their historical context, their social context, and much of what somebody from Philippi would have known. And so Paul frames much of what he says around their perception of in worldview. So that was a bit surprising to me. I guess I have very little expectation, not having done this before. I don't really know what to expect. I've kept my expectations low on purpose so that I can't be overly disappointed. So I hope that my hope is that the book does get read. I'm hoping that there are people who have questions and that may be afraid to ask, or people who are in churches today who have questions and things that have not made sense to them before, and that they have an alternative explanation to look to say, well, that makes a lot more sense to me than what I've always been taught.
And why should people buy this book?
I guess that comes out of saying, how badly do you want it? There's in the Hebraic world, it's a matter of saying, how much chutzpah do you have? Are you willing to step out? How badly do you want to know truth? If you're happy with the way your life is, if you're happy with the Christianity as you've always known it, and you're happy with that, then there's no reason for you to buy this book. But if you truly do, and not that my book is the ultimate or anything like that, there are many good books out there. There are many other ways, but if you truly want to know what truth is, if you truly desire to see through some of this shadowy complexities that have come to dominate the Christian worldview, then you're going to have to step out, and it possibly could cost you. It could cost you friendships. It could cost you difficulties. And no matter what it is, I can't fill in the blank for everyone, obviously. For me, it has cost relationships, and it has meant emails that weren't of the friendly sort. It has meant words that were harsh. It has meant being treated and having those who I love be treated oftentimes with contempt. So if that cost is not too great for you, then by all means, this might be the book for you.